debate number 2 of these. And I see where the chair is about ready to start the second debate for the evening, and it's over to you, John Beatty.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly be commencing the second semi-final of the World Schools Debating Championships. And though prior to the first round I talked about the focal point that Medicine Hat has commanded for a week on the face of the earth, I should mention some other things have been going on beyond debate. Prior to coming to Medicine Hat, we spent 2 or 3 days getting to know one another. It is the theory of some that competition is best done between those that are angry, those that are aggressive, and those that suspect each other. And those of you who believe that are wrong. It is the truth, ladies and gentlemen, that after 2 or 3 days traveling in buses and seeing ice sculptures and cattle drives, which they're sure I arranged outside of Cochrane, right down the highway, definitely stopped the bus, and going down bobsled and luge runs at 110 kilometers per hour, right, Richard? They developed a great camaraderie and friendship. And then I plunged them into something called debate. And it appeared to me that the friendship and camaraderie raised the level of debate, ladies and gentlemen. And that's something to be said for friendship and camaraderie. I don't know, but I like playing racquetball against somebody that I like. And I think these debaters have great admiration for each other. Tonight, however, they have to act the role of adversary. The role, or the debate tonight will be, this House believes that the pen is mightier than the sword. Oh yes, this is an old gem. I love it too. And on the affirmative, we will have from England, Adam Bromley, Ben Phillips, and Julian Ball. The English, ladies and gentlemen. And on the negative, and I know this from experience in '88, almost 24 hours curb to curb away from us right now, the Australians with Richard Holden, Brooke Healy, Richard Peerhouse. The Australians, ladies and gentlemen. And you may have noticed that chairing the first debate was one of the boys that, well, they're no longer boys, I guess, one of the men that went down to Australia and won it in '88. So it would only be logical that the chairman in the second round would be Mr. Simon Muller, the other person who won in 1988 in Australia. Simon Muller.
Thank you. From one chairman to another. It is my pleasure to welcome both debaters to this, the second semi-final round of this 1993 World Schools Debating Championship. I'm assuming that because they've been doing this for a week, they're familiar with the rules, but for the sake of the audience members, I'll briefly go through them. Speeches will be in 8 minutes in length, moving from team to team, beginning with the first proposer. There will then be a 2-minute break for rebuttal preparation time when it is asked that the audience try to remember that there's some intense pressure up here and these people are trying to think, and so they can keep their conversation hopefully fairly quiet for that, followed by 4-minute rebuttal speeches, and then the judges will break to consider their opinions. I will, as chairman, entertain points of orders, but only from competing debaters. There will be time at the end for the audience to voice their opinions loudly and often. Now I call upon the first proposer of the English team.
Help make it happen.
We're Girl Guides! Join us today!
Mean? Because it doesn't mean that if I want to chop say, Ben or Julian's arm off, say preferably Ben, I do not go and use a Bic biro when I could use a sword. Obviously not. Let's talk in terms that are highly relevant. When we say pen, we mean political literature, political writings. And by this, we mean both propaganda and political theories, systems of thought, which relate to polis, the root of politics, society. Then we come to the question of sword. No, we do not mean a long, sharp piece of metal. What we do mean is force or coercion, the use of force or the threat of the use of force. But the debate really hinges on the question of which is mightier, the pen or the sword. Well, by mightier, we mean that the political writings will have more influence, more power over society than force. One will actually produce a more fundamental change, will have a more long-lasting effect on society than the other. More political influence than the other. It is also important to recognise that when we say greater influence, we also mean with less effort. When this is included in our definition of mightier, it requires less effort using political literature to have influence over society than it does using force or coercion. It is a relative definition. We are not talking in terms of absolute. We do not mean that under every circumstance, in any case, political literature will always be more influential than force. Of course not. That would be ridiculous. But the thing is, and remember this throughout the debate, that when the mind leads, the body follows. When you use force, you only have control over the body. But when you control the mind through political literature, through the pen, then the body will automatically follow. It's a question of hearts and minds. I will deal chiefly with how this greater influence of political literature comes from the smaller amount of effort you require than with coercion. Ben and Julian will deal with how it has that much greater effect than force. Let's come on to this question of the least effort required for the greatest effect. Political literature. I can start a revolution with one pen. It has this knock-on effect. I'll give you examples to support my case. Ignatius de Loyola founded the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Yes, please.
You say that political writings can start things such as revolution, but we would say the real clinching effect, the thing which has the final effect, is power, is the sword.
Well, as I'm going to come on to say, the sword is only temporary, but the idea lives on. The sword leaves a scar, yes, true, but then the person with that scar dies. The idea never dies. It perpetuates itself and it lives on through the minds of other people. No, thank you. My example of the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius de Loyola, started with one book, The Spiritual Exercises. By the time of his death, he had 1,000 adherents. 100 years later, the Society of Jesus numbered 100,000. It was non-violent. It never used force. And yet it was the most powerful, the most influential organisation for propagating the Catholic faith. Far more influential than the Spanish Inquisition that used force. Yes, please.
You talk about how force doesn't produce long-term changes, yet I'd point to the French Revolution when a great deal of force was used, and yet that system that was implemented is still around today.
Well, that's interesting because I've studied this period, and the French Revolution, in fact, brought about a return of monarchy by 1815. But the ideas of the French Revolution lived on beyond the force that was used to keep it in place. Those ideas, the political influence of the French Revolution cannot be overestimated. But this was not brought about by force. The bit which was brought about by force was very easily defeated. Let's take other examples. The Roman Empire, rule by the sword. What was it defeated by? What actually sort of brought the Roman Empire down? Christianity. No, thank you. Christianity was able to defeat the Roman Empire in a struggle for power. At the time of the Roman Empire's collapse, Christianity was non-violent, and yet it had defeated rule by the sword.
Point of information.
No, thank you. It is because it has this ripple effect, because ideas live on, because when you have the mind, the body follows, that the pen will be mightier than the sword. And it's not just that. If I could go around beating up every member of the audience in order to convince you that my case is right. But what I could do is sit here and try and convince you, using writings, that I am right, which requires less effort. I think it's clear that I would get very tired if I had to beat all of you up to convince my case was right. Do you see my point? That, as Goebbels said, if you say something long enough and loud enough, people will believe you. If you say something long enough and loud enough, people will believe you. Propaganda has this knock-on effect. It gets into the mind, whereas the force coercion does not. The pen starts the seed, and which then grows into a mighty plant. Force has a temporary effect. It is not long-lasting, and the sword must be used again and again and again. When you have convinced people, you don't need to hit them to get them to do what you want. I'll give you an example. I want Mr. Ben Phillips to go and get me a cup of coffee. I could beat him up to he'd go and get me that cup of coffee. But then next time I wanted a cup of coffee, I'd have to beat him up again and again and again. So I got very tired. Or I could convince him that it was not only in his best interests, but also in my interests that I got that cup of coffee. Which is mightier, pen or sword? I think the case is clear. The sword dies with he who wields it, but the pen lives on in the minds of those people who have heard those political thought. It's a relative definition. Of course, force will work some of the time. But consider how, for instance, Martin Luther King, Strength to Love, a book he wrote about the use of non-violence, had a knock-on effect. It generated large civil rights movement, people convinced of what they wanted to do. And compare that with the Ku Klux Klan. Who had more effect, the pen or the sword? We have, I have a dream, or I have a noose and a burning cross. I think it's clear which is more powerful. The idea, the political thought. You require the smallest effort to get the greatest effect. And this is surely the most accurate definition of which is mightier. If you have the hearts and minds, people's bodies will follow. So you may have the attention if you point the gun to a person's head, but you only have that person's attention so long as you point the gun. If you would convince them through political literature, through the pen, that what you want them to do is right, they will follow. They will follow because it requires less effort and it has more effect. The pen is mightier than the sword. I beg to move.
I thank the member for his comments and now call upon the first opposer speaker, Richard Holden.
Speaker, members of the House, the only definitional problem we have with the proposition today is that they've spoken about effort as being related to might. And what we'd say to this is the term mightier refers directly to what is produced. Something is mightier if the end result is greater than the other one, and the effort put into that is quite irrelevant. But we have pleasure in accepting the rest of their definition. Well, what they said so far is a few things. Firstly, they said where the mind goes, the body follows. They're trying to play the chicken and the egg game, which came first. And what we would say to that is let's end that now. The real point here is what has final power. In the end, if you want someone to support you, what is the most effective way of doing it? Saying please support me or saying if you don't support me, I'll blow your head off. And quite frankly, it is the latter. They've said, and quite interestingly, that the sword is only temporary. It's only a quick fix, if you like. And what we would say to that is that ideas live on only as long as there is power to support them. Ideas will only live with people as long as there is something making them believe in them. And they went on to say things about Goebbels, when Goebbels said, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. And we hold up the Nazi regime as a perfect example of this. The only reason Goebbels was able to have his propaganda work was that if you didn't believe his propaganda, you had a brown shirt come and knock on your door in the middle of the night and you were never heard of again. What backed up the system? And in the final analysis, what backed it up was force. What the mightier factor was the sword. They brought up the interesting point of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King saying, "I have a dream." And they made rather whimsical reference to, I have a burning cross. What we'd say to this is twofold. Firstly, who bumped off Martin Luther King? How did Martin Luther King get finished off? He got shot. He got ended out by the sword. And what we'd say to that is that already most contemporary revisionist historians say that Malcolm X was the greatest black leader in American history. And what did Malcolm X propose? What were his ideas on how to solve racial intolerance? He said, go out and kill people. If someone is racially intolerant to you, blow their head off, kill them. And that was what he saw as most powerful, and that is what most contemporary historians see as most powerful. The classic example of the pen not working is in Burma. In 1988, pro-democracy demonstrations were crushed. And so in 1991, elections were the results of the election. No, yes, certainly.
What about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, where the ideas of freedom won over the tanks?
There's isolated examples of where the pen does work. We're not saying the pen has no might, the pen has no power. But you'll see in this example, and many others, that when the election results weren't taken favourably by the junta, all they did was just declare them invalid and shoot anyone who disagreed with them. The pen is not mightier than the sword, because in the final analysis, the sword is the highest repository of power. We have three major problems with this idea of the pen being mightier. Firstly, it relies on the goodwill of the people to act out what is being told. If people don't agree with what is being told, then the pen can't force them to do it. It requires persuasion. We would say the best way of persuasion is holding a gun to someone's head. Secondly, it relies on working within the framework of a democracy, because it relies on the idea of free speech. And in over 178 nations in the world, more than 100 of them don't have democracy. More than 100 of them don't have free speech. And the motivating factor in this society, what is more powerful in all these societies, is the sword, is force. And the third problem we find with it is this idea of a time lag. It takes time to have effect. Intellectual ferment takes time. Holding a gun to someone's head is very, very immediate. So we ask ourselves what the proposition have to prove today. And they have to prove that when it comes to the crunch, what will obtain and maintain power is the pen. And we would contradict that completely. We would say, in the final analysis, what will hold power, what will maintain power is force. Certainly.
You only look at the short-term effects achieved by the sword. We look at the long-term, the bigger picture.
I understand your point, and I've already dealt with that. We said initially, as one of the major refutational pieces, that ideas can live on only as long as there is power, as there is force there to support them. So as we've said, what this comes down to is that the sword is immediate, the sword gets immediate reactions. We don't like it, it's not pretty, but quite frankly it works. Our case is quite simply what Mao Zedong said. Power grows from the barrel of a gun. It's not pretty, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an ideal situation, but it's reality. We will show you that it is mere human nature. Maslow's hierarchy of needs shows that the second greatest need after food and water is safety, is shelter, and that this is a higher need than fourth, where persuasion and this idea of the pen and intellectual ferment comes in. At first speaker, I'll be talking about the internal aspects of this. My second, the external aspects, and my third speaker will be doing a case study of the Khmer Rouge. Internally, we need only look at the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks had a majority in the Soviets for 2.5 months before the October Revolution, but they didn't seize power then. The time, according to Lenin, was not right, and it was not right because they didn't have the support of the Petrograd Naval Garrison. And as soon as they got support of the Petrograd Naval Garrison, as soon as they had the sword, they seized power. And they kept power during the Civil War because of military power, not because of persuasion, because of the sword. And then, further, when the Constituent Assembly was elected, when Lenin didn't like the results, he said, we have ultimate power, we have the sword, forget the Constituent Assembly. And that's because power, the highest repository of power, is in force. We see in Tiananmen Square, democratic protest was crushed by tanks when it came down to the fact of some poor little Chinese man carrying a basket up against a tank, but tank won out. It sounds simplistic, but it's quite sad. The fact is that in reality, when it comes down to it, the power does grow from the barrel of a gun, that the sword is mightier than the pen. We see in the French Revolution, as we've already heard some of, how was Louis XVI overthrown? Who stormed the Bastille? It was done with power. Voltaire had been writing about the situation for over 100 years, but had that done any good? very marginal good. What really took effect was force, was power. And in the Philippines, why did Marcos lose? Why did Imelda Marcos lose her shoe collection? Because they lost military power. And when it comes down to it, military power is what preserves political power. So where this debate has come so far, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that the proposition would have you believe in this great idealism, that if I see injustice, then all we have to do is find some magnificent writer to write about it, and everyone will be convinced, and there'll be a spontaneous sort of populist uprising where we won't need force, but we'll be able to convince people with ideas. They would have you believe that words and ideas can change the world. And we would say sometimes, in isolated cases, words and ideas can change the world. But what changes the world a lot more bluntly, what has changed the world in the past, what changes the world now, and what will shape the world in the future, is not words and ideas, but force, but power. And we say it's not pretty, it's not perfect, it's not the world that we really would like to live in. But when it comes down to it, in the final analysis, power grows from the barrel of a gun. And the most mighty is not the person with the pen. The most mighty is the person with the sword.
You now will have an opportunity to hear from the second proposer, Ben Phillips.
It's not surprising, ladies and gentlemen, honoured judges, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition come from down under, because consistently their case has been upside down. They spoke about Mao Zedong. Well, where did he say politics comes from the barrel of a gun? In the little red book, which every Chinese person had, because Mao understood the power of the pen. It's very simple. What this comes down to, as we said, is the pen versus the sword. Political writings versus force and coercion. When we say mightier, we mean it has a greater effect on society. This is not a moral point. It is not about good or bad. We are not being idealistic. They called us idealistic. We are not being idealistic. It is about fact. And as I hope to show you, the facts rest on our side. We believe that that pen is mightier than sword for two reasons. One, you use less effort, and that is important, because if a strong man can lift you up with one finger, and I can lift you up with my entire body, then the strong man is more mighty than I am. It's very simple. But what we also believe, and what the Australians accept, is that it has a greater effect. Adam dealt with the effort front, I will be dealing with the side to do with effect. The fact is, as we said, the revolution, a pen can start from the smallest point. Revolution by a pen. But if you use a sword, you have to use it again and again. One pen can start a revolution, but it needs 1,000 swords.
Point of information.
Please.
We would say what perpetuates revolution, what consolidates power in a revolution, and what that is military power.
Yes, as we will demonstrate in the future, during this debate, and during my speech, you are factually incorrect there, because in the short term, yes, force may appear to work, but in the long term, it is always the ideas that win over. But I want to demonstrate first another point, because even if coercion does work in a limited circumstance for a very short time, it only works for that one person. It has what we have called a limited radius. I want to explain to you what I mean by a limited radius. Imagine I was trying to persuade you to join the Brian Mulroney fan club. I'm a founder member. In fact, I'm the only member, but no. If I wanted you to join this club, I could either beat you up, and then you might join, but you wouldn't be a very enthusiastic member. But if I persuaded you of the true right to the cause of Mulroney, whatever that cause may be, but if I persuaded you of the true right of that cause, then you could persuade someone else, who could persuade someone else, and very soon, the Brian Mulroney fan club could rule the world. That is what we call the ripple effect. Ideas, quite simply, spread through people. Julian will deal with the psychology. Not the psychology of joining the Brian Mulroney fan club. The idea to that is obvious. Insanity. No. Julian will be dealing with the psychology of persuasion against force, because quite simply, persuasion is always more mighty. In effect, in the effect of this, it always has greater longevity. That is, a book lasts longer than a scar. In the short term, force may appear to win, but in the long term, the ideas win over. We mentioned Czechoslovakia. I think it's a very important example. Because during the Prague Spring of 1968, when new, fresh ideas spread throughout Czechoslovakia, they were suppressed temporarily by force. In the short term, force appeared to have won. But in 1989, you had the Velvet Revolution, a non-violent revolution, and a poet, Václav Havel, became president. They said this was limited, but no, it wasn't, because the ripple effect, the Mulroney effect, spread it through Europe, the whole of Eastern Europe, and we saw the walls come down and freedom appear throughout Europe. Henry IV of France in the 16th century, he used propaganda to unite the people. His one real military effort, that was the war with Spain, was an utter failure. However, when he wrote about this, his propagandist claimed it was a success, and that worked in uniting the country. So although the war made no territorial gains, the propaganda did succeed in unifying the country. Or Copernicus, the first man to say that the earth went round the sun, not the sun round the earth. He was burnt by the Catholic Church because he presented more of a threat to the Papal States in Italy than any of the other city-states. It was simply the ripple effect. Ideas spread through people. Maybe the Australians still believe that the sun goes round the earth, but most of us have heard those ideas. Most of us have been won over by argument. They mentioned Russia. I think a better example than the November Revolution is the March Revolution, the revolution of democracy. Because in 1905, 12 years before, Father Gapon, a priest, had led a march against the Tsar, asking for something to be done about poverty and for greater liberty. Yes, they were shot. Yes, force won them over temporarily. But no, they won over the hearts and minds. And ripple effect spread that through the whole of Russia. No, thank you. And then you had a populist revolution in March, which took very few swords indeed. No, thank you. It is the March ideas who have won. Yes, in November, the communists took over, but now we see democracy, the March ideas. No, thank you. We see democracy spreading through Russia because ideas have won the day. Gandhi, the entire British Empire with guns and swords defeated by one man with a loincloth and an idea. They also mentioned the Nazis. Well, in fact, the Nazis failed to gain power in 1923 by a violent putsch, a violent revolution. No, thank you. They did, in fact, gain power by, as Hitler said, holding their noses and entering the Reichstag. That is, they submitted to political ideas. No, thank you. Quite simply, the pen is mightier than the sword because it takes less effort and has a greater effect. As I've shown in those examples, temporarily force has won over. But in the long term, if we take the total equation, it is always the ideas which win in the end. That is the crux of our case. Long term, the pen is mightier than the sword. Less effort and a greater effect. As we said, it takes one pen to start a revolution, but 100,000 swords. A book lasts longer than a sword. That is why we believe that the pen is mightier than the sword, because quite simply, in the long term, it always wins. Force may persuade one person temporarily, but persuasion, argument, the pen can persuade all of you forever. That is why we ask you to vote for the motion. That is also why I ask you to join me and become the second member of the Brian Mulroney fan club. Thank you.
I now call upon Brooke Healy to continue with Australia's case.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House. The proposition of today's case have talked about how ideas stay around longer if they're implemented through changing people's thoughts, through persuasion, through the pen. And they've talked a lot about how force goes away and how you keep needing to use it again and again. Well, I would say that just because someone disagrees with the system that they are being oppressed under doesn't mean very much if they cannot do anything to change it. I don't care if the point is that everybody under a dictatorship doesn't like the system. The fact remains that they can't do anything to change that system because force is preventing them from doing so. It's a sad fact, but it is indeed a true fact. They talked about Martin Luther King and how this illustrated the point about how ideas lasted on after he was gone. And I would say, how did he go in the first place? Because of force. And what's happened to the black movement since? Let's look at the LA riots, and why did they occur? Because they realised that nothing was being done through persuasion, and that the only way that people would listen to their cause, the only way they could grab the attention of the world was through force, was through violence. They've talked about how when the mind leads, the body follows. And I would say that it's the sane mind that leads the body, and it's the sane mind that would protect the body. Because if I was to stand before you and pull out a hand grenade and pull out the pin and say, don't leave, and try and persuade you, you wouldn't be stupid enough to stick around and listen. You would be out that door before I could say, come back, because you realise that there is something more important at stake, and that is your life. And when it comes to the crunch, that is what's going to take the overriding priority in your mind in most cases, because you realise that force is threatening your livelihood. They've talked about how a pen starts off the revolution. Well, I would say that it can start it off, but it can't finish the revolution. It cannot consolidate the revolution, certainly.
As we said, the Czechoslovakian Revolution of 1989 was completely non-violent, and having been previously defeated by force, won over. Ideas won.
Okay, you talk about an example of Czechoslovakia where ideas won. Bravo, here's an isolated example. The pen can work. No, thank you, I'm still dealing with your last point. Bravo, the pen can work. But what we would say is that the debate comes down to a question of a balance. In the majority of cases, which is the most powerful? And we would say that indeed the sword is. They've talked about how this idea of the revolution, and coming back to the Russian Revolution, I would say that it wasn't until they had the support of the army that something could be done about it and the revolution could be consolidated. And they've said that the pen requires less effort than the sword.
Point of information.
No, thank you. But what took longer? The military coup in Fiji or the Russian Revolution? Because trying to persuade an entire population to side with you is a lot longer, and it requires a lot more effort than going in there with some tanks and saying, I don't care if you agree with me, I am going to make you obey me. It mightn't be nice. It mightn't be what we would like it to be, but it is the way it is. They've talked about how the pen is long-term. Well, I would say that the time lag involved in the pen taking effect is too long. And who cares if one day a country like Fiji, in the future, they'll be able to say, no, those people back then were right. Well, I would say, let's look at the immediate effects. Let's look at how many people die in the meantime. And we would say that the reason those people die and the reason that nothing can be done about it is because they are under a system, no thank you, where they have the sword stopping them from allowing the pen to flourish. Because what we must realise is that only in a democratic system can the pen work. Because only in a democratic system are you allowed to express your beliefs. And we have pointed out that the majority of political systems throughout the world actually work in a dictatorship. Certainly.
None of the examples we have given have been in democratic systems. They have all been either in dictatorships or in autocracies or in empires.
Just to clarify your point, you mean your one example of Czechoslovakia hasn't been the point, which we have perfectly conceded. No, thank you, simply because it is an isolated example. Well, whereas I would say that in countries like the United States, this is a case of where the pen can influence. But in a country like Fiji, in a country like East Timor, in a country like Burma, there is nothing that people can do because they are under the oppression of the sword. They talked about how democracy is spreading through Russia. Well, I would say, how is the system being changed? The ideas are there from the pen, but the actual action, what is being done, is a result of force. By getting in there, rolling the sleeves up and fighting against the system. They've realised that this is the only way to go, and that is why they've done it. If we look at this in terms of an inter-country relationship level, we see that the sword is most definitely mightier than the pen. If we look at the case of Somalia, Bosnia, the Gulf, and the end of World War II, we'll see that these all illustrate the point. In Somalia, the United Nations tried again and again to try and settle the dispute by using persuasion. No, thank you. But what ended the problem? It was only when the United States and led the United Nations in there with the Marines that something got done, that the people got fed. I'd also like to draw your attention to the case in Bosnia. They've tried peace talks, they've tried negotiation, they've tried persuasion. It's failed, and now, this very day, Clinton has said that he is prepared to use force because he recognises that it's the only option that's available and viable. If we look at the Gulf, why could Iraq in the first place go in there and invade Kuwait? Because of the fact that they had more military might. The United Nations, no thank you, told Iraq to get out. But it wasn't until they went in there with force that they could actually drive them out. This illustrates the point that when it comes to the crunch, the sword is more effective, more powerful and mightier. No thank you. If we look at the case of World War II, the Allies tried to appease Hitler. But in the final analysis, the end result was, it wasn't until they had a bullet in his head that they'd stopped Hitler. They could talk till they were blue in the face, but there was nothing they could do without the force. If we look at the League of Nations, why did it fail? It failed because it could only implement economic and moral sanctions, because it didn't have the military sanctions that the United Nations currently has. And we would say that you need to have this force. You need to be able to have the power of the sword before you can have force, before you can have the power that we would say is implicit with the sword. Because, ladies and gentlemen, all what this comes down to is about obtaining and maintaining power. And we would say that you can express ideas, you can proliferate ideas throughout the world as much as you like. But if you have got a gun pointed at your head, there is not much you can do to change it. That if you have got a gun pointed at your head, you will be most likely, in the majority of cases, to do what that person says, because your sane mind says, my life is at risk, my life needs to be protected. Because when it comes to the balance of probabilities, when it comes to maintaining and obtaining power, it is a sad fact, but it is indeed a true fact, that the pen is not mightier than the sword, because it only works with the goodwill of the people. It only works under a system where a democracy is allowed, where people are allowed to express their beliefs. And we would say that on balance, the sword is indeed mightier than the pen.
I now call upon Julian Ball to conclude the English constructive case.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much afraid the Australian's argument is like the second speaker's hair. At first, it's very attractive, but it has gone on, and finally it's all over the place. They have refused to accept our examples. They're very, very keen on violence. And if I may, I'd like to illustrate this again. If these three big, brutish Australian boys from the outback decided to beat me up strictly in the spirit of world citizenship, then I could be possibly crippled, but I promise you, I would be adamant and I would not agree with them. However, in the vastly unlikely case that they could persuade me, I would be happy to go along with them. In fact, if their argument, if their idea were forceful enough, I would quite possibly go back to Australia with them and cohabitate. Ladies and gentlemen, an idea has that force. A gun can only coerce. You will have a slave. An idea can gain you a comrade, a much more powerful ally. That is the force of an idea. That, ultimately, is the force of the pen. Because it is a coherent idea that always motivates change. We've heard about the French Revolution. Well, what drove that? What was the fundamental force, the prime mover? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. An idea, a written word from the pen. No, thank you. According to them, force is right. Force will always win through. We don't believe this. No, I'm sorry. Force can sometimes work, but only in certain circumstances. The prime mover, the fundamental quality, the driving force, the social change, the mightier of the two is the pen. Because according to them, a violent dictatorship should stay in power forever. It has the might, the people do not. But the people have the idea. Look at South America. Once cliched oppressive regimes, sunglasses and a general's uniform. Now, blossoming democracies. Why? Because the democratic idea got into people's heads, it perpetuated itself, and it worked. Accept it.
You talk about how South America is such a classic example of democracy flourishing. I'd like to point to Peru, where the President Fujimori actually suspended the constitution and it has abolished the Supreme Court, all in the name of fighting the shining path. And the point is that he's able to maintain his power because he has the support of his army.
Yes, he has the support of his army. In some cases, violent action will be more successful. But on a global scale, when we look at the bigger picture, we find that persuasion and a fundamental driving idea are what work. Gandhi and the British, Confucianism stabilising China. All around the world, we've shown you great examples. The larger scale, the macro scale examples. Christianity toppling the Roman Empire. No, thank you. In Iraq, they've said it's purely military might that allowed Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. Well, if it hadn't been for a massive and highly effective propaganda machine, Saddam Hussein would never have been in that position of power in the first place. The more fundamental of the two qualities is what allowed him to act. No, thank you. Goebbels, we've heard of Goebbels, knocking on people's doors and beating them up. There's been a lot of beating up going on this evening, ladies and gentlemen, but I doubt even between both of the teams here today, we could have beaten up 90% of Germany. No, it simply isn't possible. It was the propaganda machine that Goebbels created that was so effective. The idea, the hideous idea of Nazism that was perpetuated so effectively, that is what brought them to power. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, you.
Firstly, may I say good choice, and secondly, we would suggest that you have referred to Nazism as the hideous idea because it maintained itself from power. That was the reason that you had the Reichstag being burnt to the ground by the Nazis and the brown shirts screaming for blood and revenge so that they'd vote for the Enabling Act and remove the Constitution. It was the force, it was the threat of force that maintained the Nazis and the Nazis.
When I referred to Nazism as a hideous idea, I meant it. Anti-Semitism repulses me. However, it was a powerful idea. It was propagated well. It was the force of the idea that brought them to power. The fundamental of the two. Force helped maintain it, but it was the propaganda machine that put them there. The idea that was more powerful.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Ideas go on. Ideas perpetuate themselves. Adam has told you how an idea will be more effective. There is less effort for the same result. Ben has told you how ideas propagate, the ripple effect. The opposition have said that power grows from the barrel of a gun. And surprise, surprise, where do we find this? In a book. The idea was propagated through a book. Mao's little red book, compulsory reading for all Chinese. The idea was the more fundamental quality. The mind comes first, and then the body will follow. Words and ideas change the world. What sticks with us? What sticks down through the centuries? What motivates future generations? Liberté, égalité, fraternity. I have a dream. Your country needs you. These are the things that inspire human beings. These are the more fundamental quality of life. Ideas have an independent existence which cannot simply be killed by force. Accepted.
You talk about how these ideas influence people, and we would say it's no good having an idea influence a person if they're in a position where they cannot do anything about that idea because there is a gun pointed at their head.
Ladies and gentlemen, the early Christians were pacifists. They had swords pointed at their heads. They were crucified, they were thrown to the lions. But the idea persisted, and it won through. It toppled the Roman Empire, one of the greatest empires we've ever seen in the world. The British had the guns and the bombs, the shells, the dreadnoughts and the battleships. But a man in a loincloth with an idea defeated us. The idea won through against force. Sometimes force will be more effective, but the idea is the more fundamental quality. Where the mind goes, the body follows. Ideas psychologically have an independent existence, which is carried down through generations. They bring social cohesion. There will always be a negative reaction against violence. Slave versus comrade. I would rather have a comrade than a slave, and a comrade will always be more effective than a slave. He will want to work with you. Ideas are mightier. Ideas are more powerful. They have that effect. Religion is the prime example. People believe strongly enough to change the world. The fervent fire of an Islamic martyr, the stoicism of the early Christians, the motivation and belief behind any world change. Loyalty is a psychological necessity. The greatest changes are brought about by true belief and by loyalty. These are ideas. These come from the pen. They are the prime mover, the more fundamental quality. They are the mightier, ladies and gentlemen. They require little effort and they have a greater effect. One book can change the world, and it has done many times over. History stands on our side. The greatest changes the world has ever seen were all brought about by ideas, by one driving force each time, the more fundamental quality. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to support the motion, because the pen always is more powerful than the sword in the long run. I thank you.
I now introduce Richard Peerhouse to conclude Australia's constructive remarks.
Mr. Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, we've had from the proposition the idea that mightier is somehow related to the amount of effort that is used. Yet we find that this idea is not even compatible with the definition which they themselves put up. The definition of what was mightier was what has more influence, more power over society. There is absolutely no notion there about which has whatever amount of effort's being used to it. And the analogy with the strong man about I'm mightier if I can lift you up with one finger instead of using my whole body does not stand in this debate, because the whole idea is that the strong man can lift you up on this one finger, which shows that he must be able to lift greater weights. Then they set them. Let's have a look at what they have set themselves, the task they have set themselves within this debate, which the criteria which they themselves chose to fulfil. They asked which has had more influence upon society. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we would support the notion of the sword. We would support the notion of the gun. Ladies and gentlemen, we were still suffering the results of World War I when World War II came about. We would suggest that in many ways we are still suffering the results of World War II, even presently. Britain has never regained its naval power since it was taken to the cleaners in World War I. It has never regained its power. Russia has only just recovered from the elections, from the revolution, the bloody revolution in 1917. And it has not yet recovered from Stalin's repression during the 1940s. Rome has never recovered from its fall. And we'd say that the fall of Rome did not happen because of the Christians. Ladies and gentlemen, it happened because the Huns rode their horses down the streets carrying a mighty big sword and chopping everyone's head off. If you have a look at the criteria they've set themselves, what has had more effect, what has had more influence, we would say that it was the gun. Now, from the nation that gave us such literary greats as William Shakespeare, as Jane Austen, and as Charles Dickens. They have given us literature, and we'd say it's substandard literature at that. We heard from the first speaker that the sword is temporary. Try telling that to the Bosnians who are presently being killed and slaughtered and have been doing so since... Certainly.
What motivates all that violence is the idea of nationalism.
Ladies and gentlemen, what kills the people? Is it the idea or is it the big guns that they're wielding? And it's been happening since September 1991. Try telling the Cambodians that have been suffering a 22-year-old civil war that the sword is temporary. Try telling the Arabs and the Israelis that have been fighting since 1948 or earlier that the sword is temporary.
What information?
Certainly.
Why then are they dealing with the ideas? Why are they trying to change the resentment? Because ideas count. The pen is mightier.
Ladies and gentlemen, he's just said that ideas count. And from this side of the House, you will have absolutely no dissension. We agree wholeheartedly. Of course, ideas count. But what is more effective? What, to use their criteria, has more effect upon society? We also had the example of the Russian Revolution and the provisional government. It was the ideas that sparked it off. Ladies and gentlemen, that's like playing the chicken and the egg game. We would say that the provisional government of March 1917 fell because it did not have the support of the army. It all goes to prove that the highest... No, certainly.
Why did the Bolsheviks have the support of the army? Because of the idea of communism.
No, we would say that the Bolsheviks had the support of the army because the provisional government had maintained the war against the Allies. The fact is that there was a bloody war going on. That's the idea. That's why they had the power. The fact is that when it comes down to it, the highest repository of power is those with the guns, those with the sword. And we've had the example of Gandhi. Firstly, we'd like to point out that it's not such a great example. Gandhi was, in fact, shot. And we'd secondly like to point out that look at what happens to India today. Look at the situation. Because there was a revolution, there was a lack of infrastructure left behind by the British. And because of that, India has suffered and become a third world nation. We'd also like to support the idea that India has one of the most populous armies in the world. And if you want to have... no, thank you. If you want to have a look at decolonialisation and what's actually happened, you might want to... what they've done is they've held up India as an example. Well, we can uphold up lots of far more successful examples where they took power and they took it with force. Examples such as United States of America. There was a war against the British. It has prospered. India has not. Such as New Zealand. There was the actual Maori Wars against the British. New Zealand has suffered relatively to India. And we heard the example of Germany. We heard from the third speaker that it was the ideas of Nazism and the propaganda of Nazism that maintained the Nazis in power. Well, we'd say to that, that's quite frankly wrong. On March the 6th, 1933, there was an election. The Nazis held all the propaganda they could possibly muster. Under Goebbels, they had every single instrument of state at their power, yet they only got 44% of the vote. No, thank you. What gave them the absolute power, what gave Hitler and the Nazis the complete power, was the force which they used when they got into power. Now, we're not saying that the pen has no power at all. What we're saying is that the sword, that violence, is, unfortunately in many cases, the highest repository of power. And for a given example of this, and we beg the opposition to come before us and tell us why it's not applicable, we have to look at Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. You see, in September 1991, there was a peace agreement. There was the idea that people could get on together. And look what's happened. It's been destroyed by the sword. It's been destroyed by the Khmer Rouge, who've come in and nullified the peace agreement. They've refused to decentralise their army. They've refused to surrender their arms. They've refused to allow the people to partake in elections. Further to that, the whole peace process has suffered. You've got Prince Sihanouk refusing to go along with it. The fact is that the pen had a chance. The pen went in there and did its best. But look at what happened. The fact is that the sword ruined it all. The sword is mightier. We've heard from my first speaker about the internal. We've heard about the revolutions and the dictatorships and how an army, how the sword is necessary to maintain power. We've heard from the external, and from the second speaker, the external examples, how the army and the sword is necessary there and holds the power, in examples such as the Gulf War. And we've heard the example of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The fact is that as optimistic and utopian as they want to be, they can't really suggest that the highest form of power relies in the sword, in the pen. The fact is that the pen can influence, and we've never disputed that. But one indisputable fact is the sword can, unfortunately, force.
I thank both sides for their comments. There will now be a 2-minute break while the debaters prepare the rebuttals. In that time, the audience is encouraged to ooh and ah, but just please do so quietly.
Eat well, be active, feel good about yourself. It's fun. It's vitality.
Well, Larry, if nothing else, I finally found out what the Mulrooney effect is.
Well, there you go. You got to learn something when you come to debate.
Isn't that right? I think, Larry, this debate was not as forceful in my estimation, nor was it as colorful as the last debate. However, I think there were some real good points made, and I think, again, how can you balance? How can you tell who is going to be the winner? Because equality, I think, was about as debate was about as equal as I think you could get.
Yeah, if we look at the English side, and I might just give you the background, England came into the quarterfinal rounds with a 7-1 record in their first 8 rounds, and Australia came in with 6-2. These were two top-notch teams right from the start, no question about that. This was no surprise to the debating community internationally either. England comes in and they give us this argument about the pen, and they draw it and they say this is looking globally, this is looking very large. I wonder if that doesn't have a very positive effect from an adjudicator's point of view in the context that this has been about new world age and so forth, and so maybe they get it on their side for that reason. Australia had to look at things very small and quickly.
Back to the chair.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I now call upon the first opposer for Australia team to deliver their rebuttal, Richard Holden.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, the biggest contention offered in this debate by the proposition has been this idea that ideas are the motivating cause for change. Ideas motivate revolutions. And what we say to that is ask 2 questions. Firstly, what implements these ideas? Secondly, what makes these ideas happen? And we say what makes it happen is coercion. And we've shown you this all throughout the debate in Russia, France, the Philippines, Germany, and many other examples, that it takes force to cause revolution. Now, their criteria for what they had to prove in this debate was what has made the greater change in human history. And we say it's force. Voltaire wrote about injustice in France, but revolution occurred when Louis XVI was beheaded. Marx wrote about a classless society, but Lenin was the one who used the army to try and implement it. And what we would say they have to prove is that when it comes to the crunch, what obtains and maintains power. And we would say that it is the sword, not the pen. Because when it comes down to the facts, if you have a gun held at your head, that is the greater motivating force. Your greater motivating force is self-preservation. Now, another one of their large issues has been this idea of the ripple effect, of longevity. And what we would say to this is twofold. A revolutionary idea can only be implemented by force. Revolution only takes place when there is force to back it up. And secondly, for the idea of longevity, The idea can only be kept alive. The idea can only be perpetuated when there is force to back it up. So often revolutionary ideas are unpopular, and the only way to back it up is through force. This is something they've ignored. And we've had this contention over the word mightier. And they said at the start, it's about influences and power. What we'd say is yes, and the debate has been about effects, not causes. It hasn't been about how much effort, it's been about what the greatest effect has been. We are measuring what the effect is, not what the motivational cause is. And we've shown you the three problems with the pen. Firstly, it relies on the goodwill of the people to enforce it. Secondly, we would say that it only works within the framework of a democracy. It only works where there is free speech. And 2/3 of the nation on earth don't have free speech. And thirdly, we would say there is a time lag. Education and intellectual ferment takes time. It takes time to take effect. The gun, the power is immediate. And our case has been that power grows from the barrel of a gun. It's quite simple. Chairman Mao said it. Power grows from the barrel of a gun. It's a sad fact, but it's a fact that exists in society today. And I've shown you this internally with revolutions and dictatorships, such as in the Russian Revolution, in Tiananmen Square, and in the Philippines, that what held the highest repository of power? What held it? Force. And my second speaker showed you externally that in inter-country conflicts, such as in Somalia, in Bosnia, and in the Gulf, it is power which gets results. It is power which has the highest repository. And my third speaker showed you with a case study of the Khmer Rouge that once again, it is power which is the highest repository. What we would say, ladies and gentlemen, that has happened in this debate is we have indeed had an idealist proposition. They have said that words and ideas can change the world. They said that ideas start ferment, that ideas can cause revolution, that ideas can cause change. And we would say change comes about, revolution comes about with force. It's a sad fact, but it is just that, a fact. The greatest motivational force in human history is war and is human survival. If someone is holding a gun to your head, you are not going to worry about reading their essay or political discourse. When it comes down to the fact, ladies and gentlemen, it might be sad, it might not be pretty, but power grows from the barrel of a gun, and the sword is mightier than the pen.
I thank the Australian team for their comments and now call upon the first English proposer, Adam Bromley, to conclude the English case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition is quite right. This debate does hinge on what we mean when we said mightier. And I made it absolutely clear that when we said greater influence over society, we also included just exactly how much effort it took. There's no such definition as absolute might. It's always within context, and we very clearly took account of that. We believe the pen is mightier not only because it has a greater long-term effect, but because a pen can and has started revolutions. They said revolutions always required force. So we said Czechoslovakia. They ignored it. They said revolutions always require force. So we said, what about the dictatorships in South America that have all been overthrown by political ideas? According to them, a dictatorship will always perpetuate itself indefinitely because it will always be using force. It can only be overthrown by force. None of these dictatorships were overthrown by force. They were overthrown by one of the most powerful human forces, ideas. Because people believed, they acted, and they acted so much more enthusiastically. Their analogy of the gun stands in one very limited case, in the short term. But it's a very, very short-term effect. If you look at the long term, which has the greater effect? Who is more enthusiastic, the comrade, which we create, or the slave? It's interesting that even the Nazis realized that the prime mover, the fundamental point they had to have before they could go using the sword, was basic support. They needed ideas. They needed political ideas. Just as Lenin required political ideas. What was the more fundamental? Barrel grows from the power of the gun, or the book in which it was written? We, of the proposition, believe it was the book. Otherwise, Chairman Mao wouldn't have written it. It's very simple to say, yes, force is always best because it's strong. But we didn't define it that way. We said mightier in the long term, greater influence with less effort. This ripple effect that we've talked about is clear. What sticks in your mind? Is it images of violence? Is it the use of force? Is it the time your parents smacked you when you did something wrong? No. It's ideas. Ideas stay in your mind. These are what motivate you to do what you do. Are you more enthusiastic when someone encourages you, persuades you, shows you why you should do something, or because they wield the whip? We of the proposition think the case is clear, that the pen is mightier than the sword for all these reasons. It has much greater effect because it works on the mind. We are not just automatons. Yes, you can hold a gun to our body. But what happens when the person who holds that gun dies? Or what happens if I say, no, I won't do that? You kill me. Another person gets up. No, I won't do that. You kill me. You cannot go on and on and on. You require an idea. Because it is an idea that will perpetuate itself. Force does not do that. The gun doesn't make another gun. But ideas do. They live on. If I am convinced of an idea, I will try and convince you of that idea. If I am told to do something, if I am forced to do something, I will do it. But I do not do it as willingly, as enthusiastically, or as well as when I am convinced. And this is why, as we've said, the pen will be mightier than the sword. Yes, in the short term, the sword may have some effect. Yes, that is true. But as we showed time and time again, it was ideas, not force, that won through. How else can you explain the success of Mahatma Gandhi? According to them, because the British Empire used force, it would always stay in power. Mahatma Gandhi would always be oppressed. But he won through ideas. It is ideas that stay in your mind, not images of violence. I beg to move.
I'd like to thank both teams for their participation in the debate this evening. I thought it was of marvelous quality. Let's see what the judges think. As soon as the judges have completed their ballots, could they please bring them forward? When they have done so, we will open the House to discussion from the floor.
Well, perhaps, Larry, I'd like to open our segment of this particular debate by saying that if Chris Reagan of the USA, was going to take Clinton's job, it seems to me that Adam Bromley of England will probably wind up being the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Well, maybe the Prime Minister.
Oh, who knows? Well, what do you think?
Certainly Adam Bromley and Richard Holden, the two rebuttal speakers, were the strong speakers and brought the cases forward. I will say something about it, but John Beatty just wanted to comment.
This is directed at the debaters, and I'm telling you now because we have a logical point where people aren't rushing out of the room. To reiterate, tomorrow, as you remember, we have eliminated most of the morning to allow you to sleep in, which will allow you to dance tomorrow night. See, there's the connection. If you sleep in, you have to dance hard, all right? But we must be at the college at 11:30. in room S159, at which time the speech finalists who come out of the Speech Host Home event, which is going to happen in about a half an hour at various homes, those finalists will do their speeches on the future, and we will pick the top three. Then we go off to the Dick Arena when we see Miss Rodeo Canada and do her routine. And yeah, we're going to see some barrel racing and so on. And following that, the very serious, I might add, debaters, very serious Sacred Circle ceremony. If you do not understand our native traditions, that is not a time to be giddy, so get rid of it before you go there. That will be a Sacred Circle ceremony to bless the worlds, following which we'll get our duds on and then go to the banquet later. So tomorrow morning, 11:30, Medicine Hat College, S159. Thank you all.
As you were saying.
Okay, the British team really appears to be a team of very serious nature. They don't get off very much on a lot of humorous sorts of things. I just kept writing down things like very solid, unwavering, unshakable, no matter what the points of information may have been thrown by the Australians at them. Often through the week with many of the debaters, sometimes you'd see a little flinch. Not a flinch tonight. They're really right with it.
It's the British atmosphere. The British have always been like that, have they not?
Well, it certainly proves well in debate. It shows a great air of confidence, and when people show an air of confidence, it's easier to believe what they have to say. Now, the question is, did in fact they have the kind of logic that will prove this situation? I think a lot of us want to believe that the pen is mightier than the sword. The Australians had the very difficult job and chore of trying to come to us with the concept that no, the sword was mightier, and to do so, they did have to look short-term, though they didn't limit themselves to that. And if made perhaps through that, they were able to get across the fact that they were looking not just short-term but long-term, this, if anything, could maybe give them a little swing.
Here's John again.
Reminded me I didn't do the obvious, which is remind you that tomorrow night you'll be able to see one of these two teams, and the Scots go at it one last time, one kick at the can to figure out who are the world champions. So I would invite you to come back, perhaps with shorter sleeves on, given how warm it gets in here when so many excited people are crushed in together, at 5 o'clock until 6:30 and see the grand final. That is tomorrow night at 5 o'clock. And ladies and gentlemen, I may not get an opportunity to thank many of you, as some of you will not be at the banquet tomorrow night. I know many of you have been with me so many times and with our committee. Barry Finkelman, Bill Nibbs, Terry Lazenby, Doug McDougall, people like that who've been helping out. Bill Cox, who I'm just looking around the audience through the lights. We all very much appreciate this incredible support and turnout. It is beyond our belief. Please come to the final. Do it again tomorrow night. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this hand I hold 3 ballots for one team. In this hand I hold 2 ballots for another team. To encourage you all to stick around and participate in the heated floor debate that's about to occur, I will announce the results as the adjudicators come out of that room and after we've had a full discussion of the matter. So anyone who wishes to comment or attack or approach it. Yes, ma'am.
To the proposition's example of Mahatma Gandhi, not Gandhi. Well, the point is that Gandhi wasn't as successful as a lot of Britain and a lot of the West would like to believe. His civil disobedience movement was only successful up to a point. After that, he was not able to prevent his followers from breaking out into riots against the British government. Secondly, what he wanted never happened. He wanted a united India, free from British rule, which again never happened. The people who were promoting violence, that is Jinnah and Nehru, the Congress and the Muslim League both used violence. They were the ones who eventually succeeded. And therefore, it wasn't the pen that worked, and it wasn't peaceful means that worked. It was the people who used force that eventually succeeded.
Well, if we look at how powerful the British Empire was, once upon a time, we can see that really no force in India could have ever defeated that. Instead, it was ideas from people like Gandhi. Yes, it wasn't all roses, and yes, India did split, but that was again partly because of the idea of Muslim separation that came first. For example, Britain and the US both have armies, but they don't fight each other because their ideas are on the same level. It's only when the ideas dispute that the fights and history occurs.
I have a question for the opposition. In your statement that the sword is mightier than the pen, why is it that the sword seems to be afraid of the pen? Because in many examples with Stalin and Hitler, and even in the United States, the force of the sword always kills off those people that are leading the pen. The reason Stalin had killed a bunch of people was because he was worried that their ideas would take on with other people. The reason that the United States started getting rid of communists was because they were afraid that communism would take hold in the United States. So if the sword is mightier than the pen, why is the sword scared of the pen?
Well, it realises that the pen has power, but in the final analysis, which can kill the other one off? Which wins? And it's the sword.
If the pen persuades enough people, then... Do you actually believe the sword is mightier than the pen?
Absolutely. It's a sad fact, but a true fact.
A great deal of pity for any team that has to argue a proverb on the negative. Things like, well, the pen is mightier than the sword is one of those things you always throw around, and I think it's hard for any negative team to come up and sort of refute what has passed down wisdom from the ages. I don't know. Does that have anything to do with the fact that you're an Antipodean as well?
Sometimes an audience loses sight of the fact that this was an impromptu debate prepared in approximately 90 minutes. And the amount of knowledge that you saw tonight and the clash and the level of it.
Would either team like to refute that?
Well, isn't it true that in most societies that the pen may put forth some great ideas, but it's the sword that enforces every single idea? Because, well, even in early Christianity, if you didn't believe in Jesus, then you were killed. And even now, if you don't believe in our ideas here in the country, you have a fear of the police punishing you and enforcing them.
Okay, yeah, can I just say that? And until Thomas Aquinas, nearly all Christians were pacifists. They believed that violence was wrong because they believed it clashed with the moral of love thy neighbour. However, Thomas Aquinas developed the idea of the just war, and it was only then that they became a much more violent religion. He said that sometimes a war, violence, was justified. Until then, their attitude had been, he who is without sin may cast the first stone.
Well, I see that the judges have returned, and I'm not sure who wishes to deliver. There's the sacrificial lamb. The decision went, as I said, 3-2 in favor of the proposers, England. And as I've just gone and made the introduction, the judge who will be delivering the comments is Anne Swirsky, and she is from Israel.
It sounds as if we've been here before. Both teams are to be congratulated. I am constantly impressed by how such young people are able to muster so much knowledge in such a short time. Up till now, there have been dictionaries and libraries available. I don't know if they were available today. I have the strong feeling this came deep down inside. Hence, we will forgive the error about the Christian Empire. I mean, it's really a lovely idea, but we will forgive you. We did feel that the Australian team should have pounced on that a little sooner. Pity you left it to your third speech. Nevertheless, what finally clinched it for those of us who voted for the English team was that the English team made it perfectly clear from the very beginning that they were talking about the long term. And the Australian team did not succeed in convincing us that that force was successful in anything but the short term. And that was what finally clinched it. There were judges who felt that the arguments ran parallel, that they didn't quite engage one another. But all in all, we enjoyed the debate. I would rather have been sitting there, as I was for the previous debate, which I could really enjoy. But even sitting there, thank you very much. And good luck to the English, and thanks to the Australians.
Ladies and gentlemen, debaters, off to the speech host homes.
Well, I don't know. You've been following these debates as I have. You possibly a little more closely than I have. But I think if I were to be on a debating team, I would want to decide on the positive issue rather than the negative, because it does seem that those who have had the positive attitude, the positive side, those are the people who usually win the debate.
Well, here it is. You're given the topic, number one. You know exactly what the topic is. It is your responsibility to find the terms, so you know what the definition of the terms are going to be going into it. If you can then properly build your case and support it, then you win. Clear as that. So you know what your job is right from the start. That's why the opponents, of course, do have the tougher job, because they're not exactly sure how the case is going to be built. They may have a question about what the definition of terms may be, and that's why, I think you're very right, or being an opposer can be very, very difficult.
It's tough.
The Australian team did a very good job. It was, as I said earlier, the fact, could they convince the judges that they had some long-term consideration? The judges said, not quite enough.
That's right. Well, I don't think there's much more to say, except
come back tomorrow night.
That's right, except we should wind this thing up, and really we will be back tomorrow. Tomorrow it'll be live, ladies and gentlemen. We will be on Cable 10 tomorrow at, I believe it's 5 o'clock is the starting time. It may be a little late. It may be 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes late, but just keep your set tuned at Channel 10, Cable 10, and we will be back. And Larry, it's been a real pleasure working with you. It's something that I have looked forward to, as a matter of fact, for quite some time. And I do hope that after tomorrow, maybe we can do this again sometime, somehow.
Really exciting, and thank you, Orr.
Okay, that's it for now, folks. See you tomorrow.